Chronicles of Christ, the Temple Cleansing. Here's a problem I don't have with any other event in this series. I can't tell you what year it happened, and my 4 witnesses are off by about 3 of them. 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, put this scene in the last week of Jesus' life. He rides into Jerusalem to the waving of palms. The next morning he storms into the temple and turns the furniture over, and within the week he's dead, and they tell it as though the one caused the other. But the 4th Gospel, John, puts the exact same event at the very beginning, chapter 2, right after the wedding at Cana, a good 3 years before the crucifixion. Same event, same overturned tables. Same whip placed by our witnesses 3 years apart. And that's only the first of the 2 puzzles, and honestly the smaller one. Because the deeper problem isn't when it happened, it's what it even was. We call this the cleansing of the temple. I'll probably slip and call it that myself, but I'm going to show you that the word cleansing appears in none of the 4 accounts. It's a label an editor printed over the passage centuries later, and it's a label that quietly settles the argument before the argument can start. It tells you a dirty thing got made clean, a corrupt market got tidied by an honest reformer. That's the comfortable picture. It may also be dead wrong. So today we test 2 disputes, not one. And far stranger, what was this, a house cleaning, an angry reformer straightening up a corrupt marketplace? Or was it something much graver, something that only looks like tidying until you know the scriptures the crowd knew by heart, an act that was less a cleaning than a sentence pronounced on the entire building? By the end you'll see why this one act, more than any sermon Jesus ever preached, is the thing that got him killed. This one's going to take some care. Let's start where the trouble starts, with a calendar that won't sit still. The question of when. Let's be precise about the disagreement, because precision is the whole game here. Open John chapter 2. Jesus has just turned water into wine at Cana, his first miracle. He goes up to Jerusalem for Passover. John is careful to tell us it's a Passover, and across his gospel he'll count 3 of them, which is where we get the traditional idea that Jesus' ministry ran about 3 years. And there, at the first of those Passovers, at the launch of everything, Jesus makes his whip and clears the temple. It is practically the opening act of his public life. Now open Mark. Most scholars pick for the earliest gospel. The temple scene doesn't arrive until chapter 11 of 16. Jesus has spent the whole book walking toward Jerusalem, and only now in the final week does he enter the city to the palms and then next morning march into the temple and flip the tables. Matthew and Luke follow Mark's placement exactly. And all 3 of them draw the fatal line in bold. It's right after this that the chief priests, Mark says, began looking for a way to kill him. In the synoptic telling, the temple action is the match and the crucifixion is the fire it lit 6 days later. So which is it, the opening of the ministry or its climax? There are only 2 honest answers, and I'll give you both. The first is that Jesus did it twice, once at the start as John records and once again at the end as the synoptics do. This is the old harmonizing answer. You'll find it in the classic commentaries, and it has the virtue of letting every gospel be literally, chronologically correct. Its weakness is that it asks you to believe Jesus staged the identical dramatic protest twice, and that 3 gospels forgot the first time while the 4th forgot the second. Not impossible, but that's a lot of machinery to save the appearances. The second answer, held by most scholars now, is that it happened once, and that John, who arranges his whole gospel by theology, not by the calendar, deliberately moved it to the front. And once you see why he'd do that, it stops looking like an error and starts looking like genius. John frontloads the glory. He wants you to know exactly who Jesus is from page 1. So by putting the temple confrontation at the very start, John makes a claim with his table of contents, that from the moment Jesus walks on stage, he is already the Lord of that temple, already in conflict with it, already pointing toward its end and his own. One scholar put it beautifully. John moved the scene so that, in his gospel, Jesus' entire ministry is Passion Week. The shadow of the cross falls all the way back across chapter 2. I won't force a verdict because the evidence genuinely allows both, and the church has lived with both for centuries. But notice what even the disagreement tells you. This event mattered so much to all 4 witnesses that each one found the single most powerful place to put it, the synoptics as the fuse of the passion, John as the thesis statement of the entire gospel. Nobody buried it. They fought over where it belonged precisely because it belonged everywhere. And that alone should tell you it was no mere scuffle with some vendors. To find out what it actually was, we have to start by throwing out its name. A sentence, not a scrubbing. We call this the cleansing of the temple. Now I have to tell you that the word cleansing appears nowhere in any of the 4 accounts. Go look, you'll find it only in the bold heading some editor printed above the passage generations later. Not one gospel says Jesus cleansed anything. The name is an interpretation that got promoted to a title, and like most such promotions, quietly decided the case before the case could be heard. Cleansing tells you in advance what happened, a corrupt market purified by an honest reformer, comforting, possibly wrong. Here's the reading a great deal of modern scholarship now favors instead, and I'll build it joint by joint so you can test each one. It says this was not a cleansing at all. It was a prophecy, an acted-out sentence of destruction pronounced on the temple itself. Start with the scripture Jesus quotes, "You have made it a den of robbers." We hear robbers and picture pickpockets and price gougers, petty crooks fleecing pilgrims. But the Greek word is not the word for a petty thief. It's less and less means a brigand, an insurrectionist, a violent rebel. It's the exact word the Gospels use for the two men crucified on either side of him. It's the word used at his arrest, "Have you come out against a brigand with swords and clubs?" It's the word the historian Josephus uses over and over for the armed zealot rebels. So den of robbers does not mean "you've turned my house into a flea market." It means something much closer to "you've turned my house into a rebel's stronghold, a fortress of the wrong kind of power." And where does that phrase come from? This is the hinge of the whole reading, so stay with me. Den of robbers is a quotation from the prophet Jeremiah chapter 7, and Jeremiah 7 is not a sermon about commerce. It is the single most terrifying sermon about the temple in the entire Hebrew Bible, a prophecy that God is going to destroy it. Jeremiah stands in that very building and tells the people, "You treat this house like a good luck charm, you commit injustice all week and then hide behind these walls saying we're safe. This is the Lord's temple, and God says through him, I will do to this house what I did to Shiloh." And Shiloh, every listener knew, was the old sanctuary God had once let the enemy burn to the ground. So when Jesus stands in the temple and quotes one line of Jeremiah 7, anyone who knew their scriptures heard the whole thing, heard him invoke the great oracle of the temple's doom and turn it on this temple in this generation. He wasn't scolding the merchants. He was announcing a funeral. And here's where the reading gets its teeth, because it explains something the cleansing story simply cannot. If Jesus was only angry at corruption, you have to explain why the commerce was there in the first place, and the honest answer is that most of it was perfectly legitimate. Pilgrims came from all over the world for Passover. You cannot herd a sacrificial lamb across the Mediterranean, so you bought your animal on arrival. The temple tax had to be paid in one specific trustworthy coin, so of course there were money changers to swap your foreign currency. And the dove sellers Jesus singled out. The law of Moses itself commanded that the poor, those who couldn't afford a lamb, could bring 2 doves instead. So the dove sellers were serving the poorest worshippers exactly as scripture required. This wasn't a black market that had crept in. It was the necessary plumbing of the whole sacrificial system, running as designed. And that is precisely the point. If Jesus overturned the tables of a system that was working as God had commanded it to work, then he wasn't protesting an abuse of the temple. He was passing judgment on the temple itself, on the whole apparatus of sacrifice and holy real estate, and declaring that its time was up. Is this certain? No, and I'll keep faith with you. The older reading isn't dead, and there was real corruption in that temple too, as we're about to see, so honest anger at exploitation has its place here. But hear how much the destruction reading explains that the tidy version can't. Why he quotes an oracle of doom instead of a rule about honest weights. Why he attacks machinery that was doing its lawful job. Why he says in the same breath, destroy this temple. And why above all this is the act that got him killed. You don't crucify a man for objecting to overpriced pigeons. You crucify him for standing in the national sanctuary and pronouncing its death. The man with the whip. We have to stop and look hard at the whip, because this is the one scene in all 4 Gospels where Jesus appears to raise his hand in anger, and it has done more work in Christian history than almost any other image, most of it packed into 2 words people love to throw around, even Jesus. You know the argument. Someone counsels patience, gentleness, turning the other cheek, and someone else fires back. Even Jesus got angry. Even Jesus made a whip. Even Jesus flipped the tables, so don't you dare tell me my rage is unchristlike. This scene has been the favorite proof text of righteous anger for 2,000 years, the verse people reach for when they want to bless their own fury. So let's test it honestly, because it will not carry nearly as much weight as people load onto it. First, the whip itself. John, the only gospel that mentions it, says Jesus made a whip of cords and drove them all out of the temple courts, both the sheep and the cattle. Read that carefully, because the Greek is genuinely ambiguous and honest scholars divide on it. It is entirely possible, grammatically, that the whip was for driving out the animals, the sheep and the oxen, and not for striking the people at all. Picture it that way and the scene changes. A man cracking a cord over the backs of livestock to stampede them out of the courtyard, scattering the merchants in the chaos without laying the lash on a single human being. I can't prove that's the right reading. Nobody can prove the other, but it ought to give real pause to anyone who quotes this scene as Jesus endorsing violence against people, because the text may describe nothing of the kind. Second, notice what the great teachers did with the anger. They didn't deny it, they located it. Chrysostom saw in it not sinful rage, but the zeal of a man choosing to suffer everything for the good order of the house. Augustine turned the whip into a mirror. Every man twists for himself a rope by his sins, he preached. The cords that drove the merchants out are the cords we each braid from our own wrongdoing. And Augustine drew from the scene not a license for fury but a duty of correction. Let zeal for God's house move you, he said, to go to the one doing wrong and stop him, warn him, make him sorry. Even the anger in the Father's hands points inward first. And here's the caution I owe you, because this book tests the uses of a text and not only its meaning. The "even Jesus got angry" verse is, I think, the single most abused proof text in all of Christian ethics. Across the centuries, whenever the powerful have wanted to bless their own violence, to burn a heretic, to break a rival, to justify a cruelty they'd already decided on, this is the scene they reach for, because a Jesus with a whip is so much more convenient than a Jesus washing feet. So test the appeal every time you hear it, including when it rises up in your own chest. Real zeal, the kind Jesus had, runs toward danger and toward cost. He cleared that courtyard knowing it would kill him within the week. Counterfeit zeal runs the other way, toward someone weaker at no cost to yourself, with your own comfort safely intact. The whip is not a warrant for that. If your anger is cheap and aimed downward and safe, it is not the anger of the man in this story. His was neither. The house he actually meant. There was real corruption in that temple. I promised we'd come back to it, and honesty demands it, because the destruction reading and the corruption reading aren't really enemies. They're two floors of the same building. And here I can hand you a witness the Gospel's critics can't wave away, not a Christian source, a Jewish one. In the Talmud, there's a bitter little lament, preserved by the rabbis themselves, about the high priestly families who ran the temple in exactly this era. It names names, the same families the Gospels name, and it goes like this. Woe is me because of the house of letter 1E25 a Nin, that's the house of Annas, the very high priestly clan the Gospels put at the center of Jesus' arrest. Woe because of their whisperings. For they are high priests, and their sons are treasurers, and their sons-in-law are temple overseers, and their servants beat the people with clubs. That is not Christian propaganda. That is the rabbis of Israel in their own sacred book, remembering the family that ran that temple as a dynasty of grasping insiders whose servants beat the people with clubs. The Gospels didn't invent the rot. Their opponents remembered it too. So the temple Jesus judged really was, at the top, a racket run by a priestly aristocracy that had turned the house of God into a family business. And that gives the whole scene its terrible coherence. Recall the prophet standing behind him as he acted. Malachi had promised that the Lord you seek will suddenly come to his temple, but who can endure the day of his coming? Zechariah had foreseen a day when there would be no traitor in the house of the Lord. And here is a man walking unannounced into that temple, driving out the traitors, quoting an oracle of destruction. To anyone watching with the scriptures in their bones, this was not a protest. It was Malachi coming true. The Lord had come suddenly to his temple, and no, they could not endure the day of his coming. But John, as always, saw one layer deeper, and it's where this whole chronicle has been heading. When the authorities demanded to know what gave him the right to do this, Jesus answered with a riddle. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. They scoffed. It took 46 years to build this temple, and you'll raise it in 3 days. And John quietly tells us they'd misheard the whole thing. He was speaking of the temple of his body. There it is. The reason Jesus could pronounce sentence on the building is that he had come to replace it. If the temple was the place where heaven and earth met, where God dwelt with his people, where sin was answered by sacrifice, then Jesus was saying with his whip and his riddle that he himself was now that place. The meeting of heaven and earth was standing in the courtyard holding a rope of cords. The true sacrifice was the man they would kill within the week. The temple's whole job was moving into a body. And when that body died, the Gospels tell us, the great curtain of the temple, the veil walling off the holiest place, tore itself in two, top to bottom, as if the building had received the sentence and given up the ghost right along with him. That's why they killed him, not for the tables, not for the coins scattered across the pavement or the doves let loose into the sky. They killed him because a man had walked into the center of their world, the temple, the beating heart of the nation, the economy and the identity and the very address of God on earth, and announced in an acted parable nobody could unsee that its day was over and that he was what came next. You can forgive a man for overturning a table. You cannot forgive him for overturning the temple, and so the sentence he pronounced on that house became the sentence they pronounced on him. Mind the coins on the floor. Gather it up then carefully, because we've handled sharp things today. What we can say plainly, something happened in that temple and it was violent enough, public enough, and serious enough that all 4 Gospels record it and 3 of them name it as the thing that got him killed. That much is about as certain as anything in the life of Jesus. The overturned tables are bedrock. What is genuinely disputed, and I've tried to keep every dispute out in the open rather than deciding it for you, is nearly everything else. When it happened, the synoptics say the last week, John the first Passover, and the honest choices are that he did it twice or that John moved it to preach with it. What it was, cleansing of corruption, or the reading I find more and more persuasive, though I won't compel you, an acted prophecy of the temple's destruction, a sentence rather than a scrubbing. Whether he struck anyone at all, the very grammar of the whip leaves it open. Real uncertainties, and I won't pretend the evidence settles them when it doesn't. And what stands underneath all the disputing, solid while the details shift, is this. Jesus walked into the holiest places people had and declared by word and by whip that God was doing a new thing, that the meeting place of heaven and earth was no longer going to be a building you could tax and garrison and run as a family concern, but a person given and broken and raised. Every reading of this scene, the gentle and the fierce alike, agrees on that much. He was making a claim about himself, and it was the kind of claim you either fall down in front of or kill a man for. They chose the second. And the choice is still sitting there on the table, which is, I suppose, the one table in this whole story that never did get overturned. So mind the coins on the floor on your way out. They roll and they catch the light, and they were never really the point. The point was standing in the middle of the wreckage, holding a rope of cords, telling everyone within earshot that the house of God had learned to walk.